If at the end of service I was to ask everyone to line up down this center aisle here, for everyone to line up and wait in line and receive something here at the end of service. If I was to tell you what you were going to receive was a card, and what was on that card, you received it freely. Well, many people might be very interested to see what would be on the cards. Some people might even be excited. They might run down to the front to try and get to the very front of the line so that they can get their card first. Well, what if what you were handed was a card with a random circumstance, and when you received that card, it immediately meant that you were going to experience whatever circumstance was on that card? And let's say some of the first people to receive their cards got their card and realized that it said, in the next coming storm, you will receive severe storm damage to your home. And maybe the next card said something along these lines, you will very soon lose your job. Maybe the case that one of your family members might pass soon. Maybe another one says that you're about to receive a diagnosis of colon cancer. Maybe COVID. Maybe one's going to say you're about to be in a car accident and maybe you will be okay, but nonetheless, your insurance company will find a way out to not have to pay for anything in that wreck. Maybe you're going to take a fall and you're going to be paralyzed. Maybe you're going to take a fall or be in a car wreck and you're going to lose a limb. The odds are, after the first couple, nobody else is coming forward. Nobody else is going to willingly come to receive this kind of fate. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to go through these difficult times. But the truth be told, people live through these things and far worse. And through the hardship, some either break under the pressure and lose their faith, whereas some continue to thrive under the pressure and grow stronger in their faith. You know, I saw this individual. He was a man with no legs. He was a man with no arms. And he had a microphone and he was speaking on a stage. I don't know if he was just a motivational speaker, but he spoke in religious terms. I don't think that he was a preacher of any sort, but maybe just motivational speaker. And this man with no arms, this man with no legs, he says most of the world tends to look at him and they feel as if he is incomplete. And they look at him with pity and they feel bad for this man. And he said in return, he says, you know, I look at most of the world around me and I feel bad for them. I pity them. I feel sorry for them because I am more complete than all of them. Because he says most of the world, statistically speaking, most of the world has not yet been obedient unto the gospel of Jesus Christ and they are still broken. But he says, I'm whole. And then he said this, he said, how unimaginable must it be for Jesus to take a man with no arms, a man with no legs, and allow him to be the hands and feet of the gospel? And I thought, wow, what kind of perspective is that? What kind of positive thinking is that to help someone to see that clearly in life and see the value even of a horrible circumstance? Well, being dealt a bad hand does not mean that you cannot live a good life. And living through hard times does not mean that there is no good to be found in your life. If you think about what James was doing when he wrote to the brethren, he is writing to brethren who have been driven out of their own homes, out of their own lands, and they were dispersed abroad, says James chapter 1 and verse 1. Yet James still wrote to them, even though they were going through persecution. Even though this persecution was spreading like wildfire throughout Jerusalem and people were dying because of their religious beliefs, and those that were living were forced into the regions of Judea and Samaria. Nonetheless, James still writes, James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. You see, many people through the difficult times will allow that difficult time to break them, and all of a sudden their spirit is broken and they feel as if life is not valuable. Where others, through great hardship, possibly no arms, no legs, still see great value in life and are made stronger. Well, James explains, James instructs, he says, even in trials, I am to approach these with joy. Well, how do I do so? How do I actually accomplish this in my life? When you think about what James is saying here, especially there in verse 2, I think I at least have to have the proper attitude about the trials of life. That's verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Now, James is being very specific here. He says, you should consider it a joyful experience when you encounter various kinds of trials in your life. Now, if you're reading from the King James Version, it will also say, when you face diverse temptations. So either way, whether it's trials, whether it's temptations, James says, consider it a joyful experience. Okay, well, let's consider this. Let's think about this just a little bit. One is inward in nature, right? That's the temptation, the enticement to sin. Well, watch what James says here in James chapter 1, verse 14 and 15. He explains what this being enticed is. Verse 14, but each one of you is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. Now, James is not saying by any means you rejoice because you fall into sin, right? Do not rejoice in iniquity. But there's something that we can rejoice about through this temptation. And that's in the enduring of it and not falling into sin. All right, well, let's think about this idea of the outward that is spoken of by James in verse 2, the trials of life. Look at what Peter has to say on this matter. 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. Very similar instruction as what James has in James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4. All right, so Peter says this, 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 12. He says, beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trials, which is to try you as though some strange thing that has happened to you. Okay, so James has said, look, you can rejoice in these matters. Peter says, don't think it's strange. These things are going to happen. Expect it. All right, verse 13. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering. There it is again. Rejoice, even in trials and temptations. Okay, verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Okay, so I can go through the temptation, I can go through the trial, I can find means to rejoice in this, but do not enter into sin because of the trials that I've faced. Don't suffer as an evildoer, a busybody, or a murderer. Verse 16. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. Okay, so whether it be temptations or whether it be trials, my perspective and my attitude need to be a certain way to make the best of the situation. And what James says is that either way, count it all joy. So it seems like, if I'm reading this right, that James is saying, even in the worst of situations, in the hardest of times, I need to find joy in this. There's a way that I can be joyful even through difficult times. Really, it carries with it the idea of that it's all good, right? Half glass full kind of mentality. It's all good. Well, I'm reminded of a story a man once told of this African king. And he had a servant, and this servant was a man who was, it's all good kind of attitude. Always positive, and sometimes it was so positive that the king kind of got fed up with it. But nonetheless, he appreciated how encouraging this man was, and he kept him as his servant. Well, the king and the servant decide that they're going to go hunting. They get out in the brush, and then the king sees this animal that he wants to shoot, and he tells the servant, hand me the gun. Well, the servant had loaded the gun. It was black powder. He gives the king the gun. The king goes to shoot, and he blows his thumb off. It misfired. And the king is furious. He turns, he looks at this servant, and he's like, what happened? How would you do this to me? And the servant says, it's all good. And the king looks back at him, and he says, no, it's not all good. He blew his thumb off. And he takes the servant, and he places him in prison, and he's been there for a solid year. The king's back out in the woods. He has no servant. The servant's in prison, and he's hunting by himself this time. Another tribe comes upon him, and they take him captive. Now, this tribe practiced much of what we see in the Old Testament, even with human sacrifices. And they decide they're going to offer up this king as a sacrifice. And they get the king back to their camp, and they realize this king's not whole. Well, the sacrifices they offer have to be whole. So the king walks away. He immediately returns and he goes to his servant and he says, I have to apologize. I'm so thankful for what you have done for me. I'm grateful and I can't believe I put you in prison. And again, the servant says, it's all good. And the king says, how? After a year's time in prison, can you still say it's all good? He says, if I would have been with you, he says, it's all good. Right? He would have been the one sacrificed. The point is, there is a way to have a very positive outlook on all circumstances of life. And this servant was very much what we might call the glass half full kind of person. You know, here recently, Chris was telling me that he is fully aware of the fact that he walks through life with rose-tinted glasses. And I think we would agree, right? He always sees the positive, the good in things. And what this means is he can spot the faintest glimmer of good in any situation. Okay, well, on the other side of this glass half full kind of guy is the glass half empty kind of people. And for whatever reason, the personalities often seem to clash because one can't understand the other, and while one's happy, the other's not, and it's a constant little bit of friction between the two. Well, let me make a suggestion. This is a little side note. We are doing people no favor by giving them an excuse for constant negativity, for the glass half empty kind of person. As a matter of fact, the Bible is very clear. The Bible teaches that all Christians are to think on those things which are true, which are noble, which are good, which are lovely, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Paul even told the brethren in Colossae, let the peace of God rule in your hearts, Colossians chapter 3 and verse 15. Christians are to be positive people reflecting the hope that they have in Jesus Christ even through the most difficult of circumstances. We're to be that glass half full kind of person. Now, I don't know about you, and this thought come to me last night as I was laying down, as I was getting ready to go to bed, and I went ahead and added it in my notes this morning. I've always considered Jonah to be a glass half empty kind of person. Did God cut him any slack because of the negativity and the poor outlook that he had on the people of Nineveh? He didn't cut him any slack, did he? Well, here's my thought, and this was a random thought again, it came right before bed. Could you imagine how the story of Jonah would have changed if he was paired up with a Barnabas in his time to go about this same responsibility that he had with Nineveh? Could you imagine how the story might have been written? Think about it. Barnabas would have ran out and he would have sold everything that he had so that he could pay for the trip, also provide funds for those who were in need along the way. Where Jonah would have gave his last dime to hop on a boat to take him in any direction other than Nineveh. But of course, Barnabas would not have been able to deal with that. He would have had to get on the boat with him to try and encourage him to go to Nineveh. Barnabas would have continued to encourage. Jonah likely would have jumped off the boat because he didn't want to be with Barnabas. Barnabas would have went in after him. They would have been swallowed by a whale. Jonah would have been complaining, and Barnabas would have been rejoicing because now they're headed to Nineveh. But the point being, it doesn't matter if there is the glass half empty and the glass half full. Nonetheless, we're called to be a joyful people. And we can't give each other excuses saying, well, it's just who that person is. The point being, it can be a real challenge to be positive through difficult circumstances, but it's not impossible. Do you suppose that there were some that could not understand why Paul and Silas would be singing praises to God at midnight in the inner depths of the prison? There might have been some, even within that group, that were sitting there thinking, you won't be singing when you taste the slop they give us in the morning, right? The negative attitude. But nonetheless, Paul and Silas had the proper attitude. They had an it's all good kind of attitude. They saw the good in it. Do you suppose it was that attitude that would have led Peter to say, yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that matter? You think about Acts chapter 4 to Acts chapter 5, how Peter and John were taken in 3 different times. They were imprisoned twice. They were threatened twice. They were finally beaten. Do you suppose the proper attitude had anything to do with them saying and rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer for Christ's name's sake? Acts chapter 5 and verse 41. Do you suppose from Genesis chapter 37 to chapter 50, where Joseph's life is nothing short of a nightmarish roller coaster with everything that his brothers put him through, and then to his rise even to this position of authority, second in command next to Pharaoh, do you suppose the proper perspective and attitude on life led him to saying, but as for you, you meant it evil for me, but God meant it good? You see, you think about what James was writing to the Jewish brethren that were scattered abroad. Following this great persecution that came upon Jerusalem, Jewish Christians who were driven out of their homes, scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, the affliction, the trials, the things that they went through, they were very real, and it was not easy to endure the affliction that they faced. But James says, with the proper attitude it's possible. You know, I don't know who said it, but a man once said, outlook determines outcome. My outlook on life often determines my outcome. And he also said, attitude determines action. So with the proper outlook and the proper attitude, I can make this much more of a positive circumstance, regardless of how difficult it is. You see, God does not tell us that we should think we might endure trials, but rather that we will. Hard times come. Hard times will continue to come. But we can't allow that to cause us to treat them any differently than we do any other part of life. We still strive to glorify God in the matter. Now, the encouragement that James has to offer is found in the next two verses. He says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Okay, so it's important that I have the proper attitude going into the trials of life, but it's also important that I appreciate the benefits that I can receive because of my enduring those trials of life. You know, in the past years, the scientific community, they have attempted to create these biospheres. And what they were doing, this effort was to create a livable, working environment. And within this sphere, this sphere-shaped dome, it should sustain life. That was their effort. And ultimately, if they could do it here on Earth, they could create a biosphere that they could sustain life in here. The plan would then be to create one on another planet, and it could sustain life elsewhere. Well, what they learned as they went through this process was all the trees, all the plants and everything that they planted were growing with unprecedented rates. They were growing like crazy. The trees were reaching mature height well before what they would in their natural environment. Now, it wasn't long, as the trees grew real fast and real tall, that all the trees started to fall over. And they couldn't understand, why are all the trees falling over? And they finally realized, do you know what we have not added to this biosphere? Wind. You see, as a tree grows, it builds up a resistance to the wind. And the more that the wind pushes against saplings, the deeper the roots grow, and the more that they grow this part of the tree that's actually called the stress wood, it helps it to withstand the hard winds. And they had failed in their biosphere to produce wind. So all the trees fall over. I think we could easily apply that the struggles in life are what make us who we are today. What helps us to build up this resistance against the trials and the hardships that we face throughout our lives. James said, knowing that the testing of your faith, it produces patience. And it's important for us to understand exactly what James is talking about here. Because Matthew chapter 18 and verse 26, when you think about the unforgiving servant as he approached his master and realized he had done wrong or there was this debt against him, he said to his master, he said, Master, have patience on me. You know that word for patience is different from the word that James uses. You see, the one that the unforgiving servant used was the idea of be long-suffering with me. James uses the word patience in the sense of steadfastness, endurance, or this staying power that helps us to stay grounded and keep us from being moved. Okay, so James is saying that the testing of our faith produces this patience This patience, that is, this spiritual quality that helps me remain steadfast, unwavering, despite the outward pressure that might be applied. So no matter how badly Satan shakes my life up, no matter how great his efforts are to cause me to fall, my faith in Jesus Christ holds me firmly upon the foundation that he himself has established. You remember how Jesus spoke of the wise builder and the foolish builder? In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 25, when he speaks of this wise builder and he talks about the things that his house would endure, he said, the rains descend, the floods come, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded upon the rock. Faith built upon the foundation that Jesus has established, that's the start of it. Enduring throughout Christianity, the trials and the temptations that we face continues to build this resistance that helps us endure the more. It's important. It's a great part of our responsibility in our life as a Christian. It is the struggles in our life that make us who we truly are. Now, I think also it is the struggles that make us complete, and that's exactly what James says. If you look, James says, he says, but let patience, right, that's that staying power, that ability to stay grounded upon the foundation that has been established by God. He says, let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Consider the words of Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 and 7, Peter gives instruction that is very similar to what James is saying, but he also provides an illustration following that instruction. All right, so look at the instruction, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6. Peter says, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials. Very similar to what James says, trials are coming, but you need to rejoice, you need to approach these with joy, but watch what else Peter says. Peter says, though now for a little while. You see what Peter's talking about is at the very most, the suffering, the trials, the hardships that we endure in this physical life, they're but for a season. It's but for a time. So even if we were persecuted every day of our lives, even if we faced hardship every day of our lives from now till the time that our life is over here in the flesh, it would be insignificant in the view of the unending eternity that waits ahead. You see, thinking about it that way, that's what would lead the Apostle Paul to say, for our light affliction. What's he say? It is but for a moment. It is but for a season. But it's working for us a far more exceeding and great eternal weight of glory, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17. Okay, now let's go to the illustration that Peter uses, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7. He says, the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. If I'm not mistaken, now this is merely on memory. If I'm not mistaken, gold's boiling point, gold's liquid point is 1,200 degrees. We're not talking about just a little bit of heat applied. We're talking about a massive amount of heat applied. And in doing so, in being brought to liquid and back to solid and back to liquid and back to solid, all the impurities are being removed from that gold. And Peter says, such is your faith, but yet it is more precious than that gold that perishes. And through all the hardship, through all the difficult times, through whatever circumstance we face in this life, if we approach it with the proper perspective, in the proper attitude, we can come through it on the other side even stronger. And that's what Peter's point is. The Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 16, therefore we do not lose heart. We do not lose heart, even though our outward man is what? Perishing. Yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. You see, we are being strengthened day by day through the hardships that we face in this life, and through the process, our character is being transformed into that which is pleasing unto God. And James says, the trials, the temptations, if you approach it with the proper perspective, in the proper attitude, you can come out on the other side better than what you were when you went in. Could you imagine having the mindset of the man with no legs and no arms? To be so positive in life to say, you know what, how unimaginable must people think it would be that God would use a man with no legs and no arms to be the hands and feet of the gospel. The Christian life is a life of hope, a life of joy, a life of love shown to our God through every circumstance of life. And far be it from us just because a day gets hard or a situation is rough that we change our attitude, our outlook, or our perspective about anything pertaining to Christianity. James says, rejoice. Peter says, rejoice. Even through the difficult times. It's a challenge to have that mindset. It's hard to be that positive about every circumstance and every situation in life, but it's not impossible. We of all people, when times get tough, when times are hard, should show a certain joy that's not found anywhere else in the world. Regardless of how difficult it is, there should be a certain positive light about us that reflects the light of Christ regardless of circumstance. And maybe it's the case that throughout the week, even with the most minor of difficult times, that all of a sudden we start behaving in something far from the behavior of a Christian. Maybe it's the case that we lose our cool. Maybe it's the case that all of a sudden we do things or say things that we should not say. Maybe we need to repent of those things. Maybe we need to make change in our lives. You have an opportunity this morning. Whatever the case may be as you go throughout the remainder or the rest of this week. However difficult, however good it might be, approach it with the same attitude. Have the same joy seen in your hope that you have through Christ and His sacrifice. Maybe it's the case that you've not yet truly experienced that joy and that hope that can be found through Him because you have not yet been made part of Him. Whatever the case may be, we can help you with it. We can help you understand and teach you exactly what it means to become a child of God and what it means to be a child after the fact. Whatever the case may be. If you have need, please take the opportunity. Let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.